Hi, this video is for reading 37, which is entitled Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakisha? And should say Jamal, a field experiment on labor market discrimination. And it's based on the research of Bertrand and Mullenathan. So, a pretty short little reading, largely focused on describing their audit study and the findings. So, we do get a little bit of background. The reading starts by noting that there is significant racial inequality in outcomes for every significant labor market indicator. And so this is, everything from, initial interview to callbacks to being hired, to even things like compensation. And so the question is why? Why do we have these indicators? And um, is it due to ongoing discrimination, or has this type of discrimination in the labor market been eliminated? And in fact, what we're kind of seeing is like a relic of the past, by which they mean, due to past policies, in past treatments in this country. Perhaps minority applicants just have less human capital, or interviewers, or don't necessarily have the skills or education, that a job requires, or at least not comparatively to non-white applicants. So, or is it because they have these things but there is just still ongoing discrimination? And so they talk about how they want to design a study that kind of addresses that. And part of their reasoning as to why they think such a study is needed is they have this whole discussion around affirmative action. Because for people who think that this type of ongoing discrimination no longer occurs, then their lack of support for affirmative action policies, or for the enforcement of affirmative action policies, is usually predicated upon this belief that this type of discrimination isn't really occurring, it's being overstated, and therefore affirmative action isn't needed or warranted. So this is kind of the background of what they are trying to test and why. So then we have like, probably one of the longest explanations of methodologies and designs, comparative to past readings. So they discuss this in great detail on pages 190 to 191. So first of all, they say, that they set this up to be similar to a field experiment used in the UK. And just so you know, whether you're using the term field experiment, or sometimes we refer to them as audit studies, it's this idea that you're taking some level of experimentation and you're applying it to the real world. So you're testing how things, play out in the real world, but there is this kind of level of artificiality. And here the level of artificiality has to do with that creating a bank of resumes. So they have this whole description about how, they created these resumes, and they send these resumes out in response to Chicago and Boston newspaper ads, and four occupational categories in particular: sales, administrative, clerical services, and customer services. And so they create resumes that relate to these four occupations, and then they manipulate the perception of race, based upon name. And so they talk about that, when they talk about the identities of the fictitious applicants. And so they talk about, how do they decide what are white names and what are black names? Or they talk about turning to data from birth certificates. And then they also conducted a survey to see, like in Chicago, to see, which names people associate with one race as opposed to another. Um, and then they also experimentally vary the quality of resumes by giving some of them what they call higher quality attributes. And so this would be things like, uh, at school employment experience, volunteering experience, military experience, foreign language skills, certification degrees. So some additional qualities that they think would make the resume stand out as being higher as opposed to lower quality. Then in part C of the experimental design, they talk about how they went about measuring responses. So basically, they kind of just set up a phone bank, and they just kind of saw, which resumes received either a callback or an interview or an email for interview, right? So that's kind of how they went about addressing the response rate for these fictitious identities. So once again, just emphasizing, these aren't real people's resumes. These are resumes that they created based upon samples, and then they did that whole black name versus white name assigning as a way of establishing racial identities. So was there a racial gap in callback? And there was. So white names had a 9.65% chance, and African American names had a 6.45% chance. So, it must have been a tight job market, because it's not like people were getting a lot of callbacks, period. But that 3.2 percentage points, they say, is about a 50% difference in those rates. And that can solely be attributed to name manipulation, because the resumes were, except for those racially tinged names, the resumes were identical. And keep in mind, this is just the response rate for an interview, so it's not like they ever met a real person. And so, that is the assumption that they make. So then they say, what theories are being supported here, and that's in the part where they talk specifically about interpretation. Was it the taste-based model or the statistical discrimination model? So before we talk about their findings, let's just taste-based models basically say that there are prejudiced taste that employers are emphasizing, whether the prejudice tastes relate to the customers, the coworkers, or the employers. And then the kind of statistical discrimination model kind of says that, that it's not necessarily um, the the role of race, but it's the idea that there are these qualities that aren't necessarily race based, that are not being identified by the researcher, but it's these qualities that are contributing to the gap, which on the face of it looks like race. So, you know, they definitely say that um, it seems like uh, there is more evidence for the taste based versus the statistical discrimination model. Um, Although they do offer on page 94 that there might be like an alternative model, what they call the lexicographic search, where they basically use like quick heuristics in reading these resumes. And so they read the resume, they see an African American name, and then they don't even consider the skills. And so for this reason, they say, I mean, so that still is shows the role that race plays. But for them, that also might explain why African Americans don't really receive a differential return to resume quality, because for them that is almost the more surprising finding. The fact that there is a gap in callback based on applicants' names and it appears to be related to race is probably not surprising to many people. But then when they look to see how resume quality would impact response rates, you could kind of tell by how they worded that section that they expected that race would matter less for higher quality resumes. But what they found was is even when they had these higher quality characteristics, African Americans experience less of an increase in callback rates. So page 393, they note that African Americans with higher quality resumes receive a 6.7% callback, and African Americans with lower quality resumes receive a 6.2 callback. But so, it doesn't seem like the resume characteristics are really making a difference in the overall callback rates. And so we can kind of see that. And once again, it has a more positive and a larger effect for the white names. And so for this reason, because there seems to be this kind of racial bias that holds across two different models. That's part of the argument they offer as to why the statistical like discrimination model is probably not the best explanation for what they are considering here. So, in conclusion, what do they suggest? They say that, this paper suggests that African Americans do face differential treatment when searching for jobs, and that even applicants who have, higher skills and credentials, they still face this effect and this treatment. And for them, they say that this has important policy implications, because for some people that the answer is for African Americans to increase their human capital, to take part in training programs and add more credentials. This research suggests that this may not be enough to alleviate the racial gap. And so, although they aren't directly calling for continued affirmative action policies, it is research such as this that suggests they still might be needed. So I'm not providing any additional sociological background for this particular reading. So I'm just going to end with the question. This reading can be a little bleak in regards to what it suggests about the US labor market. And it doesn't really pose a lot of solutions. Do you think there is value or utility to these types of experiments? Whether you, like I said, sometimes they're called audits, which the primary reason they exist, especially in the field of sociology, is to show that discrimination exists. For yourself, although they don't pose much in terms of solutions, do you have ideas on how we as a society can do more to assure that racial discrimination does not occur in the hiring process?